We are not your mascots.
This is Chief Wahoo's, not the official logo anymore. It's paying homage to the history, okay? Keep trying to create...
Dumbasses!
Keep trying to...
You are dumbasses!
Trying to create an issue.
Okay. Offensive to us. If I walked around like a white man looking like that, I'm sure I'd offend some white people.
This is not going to change. Whether you guys like it or not, it's going to stay. Okay, 60% of the Native Americans, all right, don't care or support it. You want to tell me?
All those people terrorizing.
Last night, 200 non-Indigenous commercial fishermen gathered outside a lobster pound. It's where some Indigenous fishermen had been holding their catch.
Cops just sitting there while they take all these crates up.
This Indigenous fisherman says he barricaded himself inside.
They said they won't let me leave unless they have my lobsters.
While the group outside destroyed lobster, threw rocks,
Boy, almost got me in the head with it.
and vandalized vehicles.
They slashed the tires. I watched one guy pee in the driver's seat of my truck.
But again, it seems that last night there were officers witnessing what you described as criminal activity, yet no arrests were made.
It's a measured approach.
The thumping pulse of the tomahawk chop, one rhythm for most Indigenous mascots, the heartbeat of racism. Indigenous or Native mascots are out of place, a relic of colonial racism. They should challenge our cultural delusions of diversity and equity. How can we preach about inclusion and still feature discriminatory ethnic images on TV, in schools, and in the mainstream? Indigenous mascots are not just a harmless diversion. Mascots are a refuge of white supremacy. More than sports, Indigenous mascots increase the tolerance of racism in society. Through Indigenous mascots, society learns that it is okay to marginalize people dependent on their ethnicity, to make fun of others because of the color of their skin, to bully children who are different than you. Mascots, because they perpetuate racism, are a threat to each person's dignity. Indigenous mascots also teach Indigenous people to expect lesser treatment, to accept that North American societies were built without them. When settlers believe a tabula rasa, or blank slate, was created by wiping away Indigenous societies to create a new world founded on colonization and immigration. This is more than a fight against harmless mascots and children's games. It is the fight against the racism that Indigenous mascots represent. It is about disrupting a culture of Indigenous bigotry that reveals itself in centuries of struggle since contact. I'm Brad Gallant, a member of the Halapu Mi'kmaq First Nation. I have been fighting Indigenous mascots for the past 7 years and have had some success showing the human rights inconsistencies in the cultural discrimination represented by Indigenous mascots. I have used human rights law to attack Indigenous mascots' financial and cultural supports. In this documentary, I'll explain why Indigenous mascots preserve colonial racism, how Indigenous racism is more severe than we acknowledge, and why the continued mainstream presence of Indigenous mascots requires wholesale participation in the culture of Indigenous discrimination, demonstrating a refusal to address systemic racism. Indigenous mascots reveal that Canada is not the inclusive society that we think, or we hope, it is. Generally, Indigenous complaints of racism are ignored. Defining discrimination in September 2020, Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs took a stand against racism while giving their Indigenous racism a free pass. Can you imagine the frustration of having your culture mocked by your favorite sports league? Or by having the entire nation celebrate the genocide of a continent on its day of Thanksgiving? In 2018, Canadian Thanksgiving, or Indigenous Peoples' Day in the US, was filled with national broadcasts of the Blackhawks, Braves, Chiefs, Eskimos, Redskins, Seminoles, and Indians. Just like the traditional Dallas-Washington game on American Thanksgiving. The Washington football team's decades-long resistance to changing its name was not unique. Nat Nobed, the president of Canada's Inuit organization Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, met the owners of the Edmonton Eskimos in 2016 and said the team's name is disrespectful. We are Inuit, not Eskimos. He was ignored. CBC, like the Washington Post, did informal surveys of Inuit people to report that few care about mascots, to excuse Canada's mascot traditions. Or in 2015, when I met with City of Mississauga officials who said the city was not responsible for what affiliated organizations put on their walls. The Blackhawks logo was not equal to the swastika. They did not agree that having an organization posting a neo-Nazi symbol was the same. The swastika is an obvious symbol of hate. Like most Canadians, they minimized Indigenous racism. Mississauga's response fits with most responses to Indigenous mascots. Mascots are not subjected to the standard tests for discrimination. They are given a free pass, even though, per the Ontario Human Rights Commission, they ought reasonably to be known as offensive, like racial epithets, slurs, or jokes. Being subjected to racial name-calling or nicknames. Racial cartoons or graffiti. Comments ridiculing individuals because of race-related characteristics, etc. Singling out an individual for teasing or jokes related to race, ancestry, place of origin, or ethnic origin. Being subjected to inappropriate references to racist organizations. Or circulating racially offensive jokes, pictures, or cartoons by email or having a racially offensive screensaver. Indigenous mascots live in a moral vacuum. They are allowed to exist even when our laws or common morality says they should not. They define a culture that does not see Indigenous people as equal. The mistreatment of Indigenous people is so commonplace, pointing it out is met with derision. It makes one wonder if the issue is accepting the reality of Indigenous racism, or is the difficulty accepting the responsibility for its consequences. In 2014, the University of Notre Dame's football team played at FedEx Field, home of the Washington football team. Business ethics at Notre Dame is a big deal. it would lead you to believe that the university would not do business with a slur. As an alumnus, I was surprised by the hypocrisy and disappointed as an Indigenous person. Clearly, I am not ND. I started to pay attention to Not Your Mascot activism, like the Eradicating Offensive Native Mascots Facebook group led by Jacqueline Keeler. The group complained to the Federal Communications Commission in the U.S. in October 2014. I complained to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, but by augmenting my complaint with a request to have an offensive language warning on the Washington football team broadcasts. From business training, I knew that an offensive language warning would end sponsorship from most family-orientated sponsors and create market incentive for name change. While waiting for the CBSC response in early 2015, I went to my daughter's school hockey tournament. Aware of mascots, almost every kid had an Indigenous club logo. While there, a Mississauga Chiefs member tried to recruit my daughter. We discussed the mascots, and he said to get used to it, it was never going to change. The man's manner mirrored a past interaction with a boss telling a Newfie joke at work. So it inspired me when someone said mascots were never going to change. After thinking about how to change the names, I listed the 4 or 5 teams that used Indigenous mascots in Mississauga and thought it would take years to convince each team. Googling teams taking part in Hockey Ontario, I found that most of the teams with Indigenous mascots were in Mississauga. Yet on every Mississauga ice rink wall, there is a spectator's code of conduct that bans harassment, like the code of conduct standard in ice rental contracts. So it was surprising that the city was supplying free ad space and reduced community ice rates to organizations that use discriminatory Indigenous mascots. The city was the largest single funder to Indigenous mascot sports organizations through ice subsidies of about $70 per hour. To an organization like the Mississauga Chiefs, with almost 100 teams and over 100 hours of subsidized ice some weeks, the loss of the subsidy would be substantial and be a market force to change the name. The human rights approach is different from earlier court attacks against Indigenous mascots. It is different from trademark complaints that have been used against the Washington NFL team. Those complaints attack freedom of expression, a concept that even people who hate mascots, like me, support. The trademark complaint can be a limitation on other people's freedom of expression and creates resistance to change. It is different from a human rights complaint by Indigenous activist and former member of a tribe called Red, Ian Campo, made against the Nepean Redskins team. His strategy would be time-consuming to replicate against each team, and quite frankly, it would be bullying to attack the resources of smaller community associations to defend a HRTO complaint. The premise of the municipality complaint is that the government cannot give display space or money to organizations that discriminate. The logic of my case was the basis for the Douglas Cardinal versus Major League Baseball court case during the 2016 American League Championship Series. Public display and support of discriminatory images, whether it was Cleveland's Chief Wahoo or public buildings displaying prayers, favor one culture over another and has no part in public arenas. Complaints against municipalities, school boards, or mascot advertisers attack the enablers of racism. Enablers that prop up the culture of Indigenous racism by turning a blind eye, or worse, providing financial support to those who discriminate. Enablers who make it impossible for Indigenous children to go to school, an arena, a mall, watch TV, or browse the internet without corporate-sponsored or institutionally sanctioned racism. Or the teachers, the coaches, and the parents who understand the harm caused by Indigenous mascots, but intentionally deny dignity to Indigenous either because of the cost of the image changes or the belief that they have the right to deny others guaranteed rights by their petty political votes. Proof of concept can be seen through the successful pressure by FedEx, Pepsi, and Quaker Oats in the Washington football team name change, and by Bel Air Direct and the Edmonton football team. Their commitment shows the need for all parties to be engaged in equity and the role that market forces can play in social justice. An equity argument works because it extends human rights protections to all people and does not target other people's rights. Linked to the funding for discriminatory organizations, the strategy attacks the financial streams for Indigenous mascotted teams. Financial streams created when we allow racist images to adorn our schools, student clothing, and municipal buildings. Why does a public company that employs and serves Indigenous people contribute to a poisoned environment by sponsoring Indigenous mascotted games? Can you imagine a corporation sponsoring the showing of Triumph of the Will in prime time? Yet hundreds of companies line up to sponsor Indigenous mascotted sporting events. This concept is the concept that will end Indigenous mascots. Change is coming. If the Human Rights Tribunal did its job, financial support of Indigenous mascots would have been identified as creating a hostile environment. Institutions and companies who have employees or customers of Indigenous descent would face a material financial risk for supporting Indigenous mascotted teams. But the HRTO did not. In November 2018, I reached a settlement with the City of Mississauga with the participation and support of the Ontario Human Rights Commission to remove Indigenous-themed mascots, symbols, names, and imagery from its sports facilities provided they were found offensive by representative Indigenous agencies. The settlement left open the possibility of having to endure mascots that I find offensive. Yet, it eliminates a key support for Indigenous mascotted teams. With the removal of banners from city arenas, public acceptance of mascots is weakened. The settlement led to the Human Rights Commission of Ontario working with 40 other municipalities to address Indigenous mascots. The Mississauga settlement followed a September 2018 settlement with the Dufferin-Peel Catholic District School Board in Mississauga, Ontario, to ban Native mascot wear in its schools. If other kids know that Indigenous mascots are discriminatory, they will not buy the team's merchandise. Apart from Dufferin-Peel, no other Ontario school board has banned mascot wear, even though the Ontario Human Rights Commission has highlighted the negative effects stereotypes have on Indigenous youth.
Educationally, a big part of inclusion is to help students feel safe and included in the classroom. It is also important for students to see themselves represented in educational materials. These representations need to be present in a positive way in books, on visuals around the classroom, and in the curriculum. When the only way Indigenous students are represented in the school is through Indigenous mascots on clothing and in posters, these students are conveyed in a negative way. They are reminded how society sees them as lesser and that they are not included in that school environment. Mascots in schools are a constant reminder of the lack of equity in the environment to all students. These visual reminders can weaken the resiliency of Indigenous students by adding another risk factor instead of protective factors that schools are expected to provide. To create an inclusive environment for Indigenous students in schools, these negative barriers need to be removed. All students must be aware of how hurtful these images are to Indigenous students and their families.
Even still, there is resistance to change. From leagues who make money of traditional racism, represented by Indigenous mascotted teams. from TV networks and fans who are invested in the leagues and their accepted racism. And unfortunately, from Indigenous groups and bands who have grown so accustomed to the persistent racism that they have adopted the images as part of their own identity, rather than expect true equality. This is troubling because even though one group or certain individuals are accepting of Indigenous mascots, they should not give permission for society to continue discriminating against other Indigenous who do not approve. After the meeting with Mississauga in March 2015 to address their funding of Indigenous mascotted teams, Mississauga considered the complaint for about 45 minutes before they denied their responsibility. Disagreeing with their position, I told them a human rights complaint would be filed in 2 weeks, giving them time to reconsider. Shortly after the City of Mississauga meeting, my request for an offensive language warning was denied by Canadian broadcast standards. The denial included the statement, "Redskins evoke positive images of First Nations people." That wording left me in disbelief. Take that logic to a sexual harassment hearing. Yes, a physical feature of that person's body was mentioned, but that physical feature is highly desired on that person's body, so they should understand the compliment. Did this open a door to challenge? While not an avenue I intended to take, could the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal recognize that saying Redskins is okay because it evokes positive images as discriminatory logic? While following through on the commitment to file a complaint versus Mississauga, I was hoping the national complaint would recognize the discrimination of mascots, making the Mississauga complaint redundant. Unfortunately, in August 2015, the Canadian Tribunal said that I was appealing the CBSC decision, not complaining about their discriminatory reasoning that Redskins evokes positive images of First Nations people. The game begins. Meanwhile, I responded to Mississauga's rebuttal to my complaint with Ontario Human Rights. Mitch Beard supplied materials from his activism versus the Thorold Blackhawks to help. Unlike Mississauga, the City of Thorold consulted with the Ontario Human Rights Commission and worked with Mitch. Mississauga defended their position, and something in the city's response made me try to find common ground with the writer. His surname was Irish, and I tried to compare the annoying incorporation of Irish slurs like paddywagon and Irish twins in mainstream culture. An internet search on Irish slurs revealed an image on scientific racism to support the argument. I looked at the image and the images of the mascots. Indigenous people are depicted as Neanderthals in most sports mascots, with images featuring a sloped brow. I contacted Dr. Nina Jablonski at Penn State, leader of the project on Being Human Today, The Effects of Race, to see if she saw it as well. Dr. Jablonski agreed about the influence of scientific racism and said the topics of scientific racism and Indigenous mascots had not been previously linked. The presence of scientific racism shows how Indigenous mascots preserve white supremacy. A sloped brow is an attribute white supremacists link to inferior peoples. Like Calvin Candy in Django Unchained, looking for the justification of slavery in Old Ben Skull. The related theory of scientific racism was debunked by UNESCO in the race question after crimes carried out in the name of white supremacy during World War II. That UNESCO paper was influential in Brown versus the Board of Education, a landmark U.S. civil rights case that ruled segregation of schools was unconstitutional. Through Indigenous mascots, along with other rejected themes of discrimination, images inspired by scientific racism endure in mainstream sports. White supremacy is foundational to Indigenous racism. It was a belief in white Christian supremacy that was the justification of conquest. Indigenous mascots are part of that stereotype of the savage, inferior Indigenous person whose land, under the papal gifts called the Doctrine of Discovery, was justifiably taken from them. Collectively, the papal bulls that constitute the Bulls of Donation, from Dum Diversas of 1452 to Inter Cetera of 1493, were also used as religious justification of slavery. While these papal bulls of donation no longer doom Saracens, pagans, and other unbelievers to perpetual servitude, control of the possessions granted by the doctrine has never been rescinded. They are possessions rightly rewarded to the deserving believers of the Catholic faith. U.S. and Canadian Supreme Courts have used this doctrine to justify government domain over North American land. In 1823, in Johnson v. McIntosh, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. government had extinguished the title of Indian land, acquired via the Royal Proclamation of 1763, under the terms of the Doctrine of Discovery. To decide otherwise was to invalidate U.S. title to all lands. In 1990, the Supreme Court of Canada, in R v. Sparrow, stated that since Canadian title was never in doubt, the U.S. opinion of Johnson v. McIntosh holds. Canada and the U.S. have been founded upon the denial of Indigenous rights. Recognition of Indigenous equality is more than complicated. If Indigenous people are equal, then the very title to land taken in the name of Christian superiority is in doubt. Therefore, anchored by the cultural cornerstones of white supremacy and the Discovery Doctrine, Indigenous mascots perpetuate a culture of racism that is almost universally tolerated. It is this culture of racism that is at the root of many issues Indigenous people face today. Indigenous racism is the common thread that reveals itself in tragic consequences, from residential schools.
Odds of a child dying in Indian residential schools, 1 in 25. Odds of a Canadian dying while in service in World War II, 1 in 26.
60 Scoop.
Indigenous were adopted like pets.
Forced foster care.
7.7% of all children under 14 in Canada were Indigenous, but they account for 52.2% in foster care.
Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Between the years of 1980 and 2012, Indigenous women and girls represented 16% of all female homicides in Canada, while constituting only 4% of the female population.
Indigenous incarceration.
Indigenous are 4.4% of Canada's population, but make up 30% of Canada's incarcerated. 42% of women incarcerated. Adam Capay spent 1,657 consecutive days in solitary confinement.
Indigenous health care.
The government forced sterilization and medical experimentation at institutions like the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital.
Indigenous youth suicide.
First Nation youth suicide rates are 5 to 7 times the national average. Inuit youth suicide rates are 11 times the national average. Indigenous mascots lower self-esteem and contribute to suicide rates.
And ongoing problems with education, housing, and water that in some communities would make Flint residents horrified.
The Indigenous education funding gap is $665 million per year, with 110,000 Indigenous students, That's $6,045 per student per year. 25% of Indigenous housing needs major repairs versus 6% for the rest of Canada. Grassy Narrows is one of 400 First Nations with water advisories since 2004. Grassy Narrows problems are from the 1970s.
I'm one of many people of Indigenous descent in North America. I am of mixed descent and am a member of the Halapu Mi'kmaq First Nation Band from Newfoundland, Canada. The Mi'kmaq Nation is one of many nations from across North America. Indigenous nations are diverse, but can be, like smaller countries in Europe, aligned into language families where cultural beliefs are shared. Not all Indigenous look the same or speak the same way, nor share common cultural ideas. Just like Swedish people are different from Greek people. The Halapu are descendants of Mi'kmaq who stayed in Newfoundland and who regularly crossed the Cabot Strait from Nova Scotia to hunt, fish, forage, and, if able, farm. Newfoundland was originally home to the Beothuk, a North American Indigenous band encountered by Europeans, first by the Vikings 1,000 years ago, quite possibly by a Portuguese explorer, João Vaz Corte-Real, in the 1470s, before Columbus contacted North America, and before the English financed John Cabot landed in Newfoundland in 1497. That progression makes sense. The Vikings moved along the coastal islands to Newfoundland. The Portuguese followed fishing grounds 2,000 kilometers from the Azores, about halfway between Portugal and the Grand Banks fishing grounds of Newfoundland's southeast coast. There are 16th century writings that state Corte-Real was given land on the Azores for discovering Terra de Bacalhau, Newfoundland, in 1472. Columbus would have been the third European to contact North America when he made the 6,000-kilometer trip to the Caribbean. When the merged world began, the Beothuk used red ochre for tribal identity, to decorate their bodies and personal possessions. The redskin stereotype most likely extended from this first encounter with indigenous North Americans. It was the genocide of the Beothuk and cultural discrimination against indigenous that influenced many of my ancestors to hide their heritage. As Harold Horwood put it in a 1959 Maclean's article, the Beothuk were people who were murdered for fun by early British settlers who believed in killing the nits, the children, as well as the lice. The Beothuk genocide taught the people who have become the Halapu Band to deny their identity to escape persecution. Their existence was also denied for political reasons. When Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, Indigenous existence in the new province was denied by Canada's last founder of Confederation, Joey Smallwood. As part of the application process to form Halapu, I had an affidavit from an older cousin who said my maternal great-grandparents would argue over who was more native, as if being whiter determined the winner. This story is consistent with the experience of many Halapu people. Halapu is a new First Nation with a tenuous membership list. I can trace recent Indigenous heritage through both maternal and paternal lines, but since Dad died weeks before an arbitrary date, And because I moved from Newfoundland for economic opportunity, my full membership within the community has been revoked. Mom is a member. Dad's living siblings are members. But I am not a full member, and I cannot pass on my membership to my children. My daughters, who like me were members of the Elmas-Dagoig Mi'kmaq Band and members of Halapoo's first founding list, are no longer members due to a cost-containing supplemental agreement. They lost all status even though their first cousins who live in Newfoundland and who share the same genetic link to our heritage remain full members. My son, since he was born in Japan and does not have a long-form birth certificate, was never formally accepted by the Halapoo. My experience with the government is the basis of a belief that the government manages Indigenous heritage like a liability it is eager to end. In 2013, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Greg Rickford, now Ontario's Minister of Energy, Mines, Northern Development, and Indigenous Affairs, described band membership applications, which were 4 times higher than expected, as questionable. This was a month after Rickford welcomed disgraced former Senator Lynn Beyak to the Senate. He saw his barbecue buddy Beyak, whose tenure would be dominated by racist activities purporting the benefits of residential schools and posting of anti-Indigenous letters, as well suited to represent Northern Ontario. Rickford couldn't think of somebody better to do that. Was Rickford's bias, his open efforts to reduce liability or burden, a factor in Halapoo negotiations? People in our family may exhibit physical characteristics you believe are Indigenous, and people may not. When it comes to encountering Indigenous racism, many have the choice of identifying Indigenous heritage and do not encounter racism automatically for being Indigenous. I am a member of a targeted group, but have not been racialized, excluded based upon my appearance. This minimizes my experience with racism and changes my Indigenous experience in many ways. I cannot speak for all Indigenous peoples, but the stereotypes of Indigenous mascots affect all Indigenous people, reducing our family's heritage in many people's eyes. When speaking against Indigenous mascots, I speak to defend my home and heritage, to remove the limitations of Indigenous stereotypes. Acknowledging my Indigenous heritage is the recognition that being Indigenous or part Indigenous holds no shame. It is not a mark of inferiority. Mi'kmaq culture should be valued equally to other cultures. Older people in our family were taught to deny our relationships to prominent Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq, but I think it's great. Originally, the Mi'kmaq Grand Council refused to recognize Halapoo. But who cares? We should never have to kiss any ring to recognize or be proud of our heritage. My belief in Indigenous equality is a problem for some people. They refuse to acknowledge the humanity of North America's Indigenous people. They accept the role assigned to Indigenous people in North American culture and see the role of the inferior Indigenous person as a justified tradition. As a person in a newly formed band, like many Halapoo, I have undergone a process of learning more about our culture and what it means to be Indigenous in Canada. I used to think Indigenous mascots were acceptable, but many people in Newfoundland did not. Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador changed the Beothuk logo in the 1980s. Why celebrate the genocide of a people? Inclusion in a group made me aware of issues that I had been blind to before. My discussions of Indigenous mascots with non-Indigenous are always responded to with snickers and derision, with attitudes considered offside when used with other races. It reminds me of arguments for Newfie jokes, but with a severity unique to Indigenous racism.
Why does each group need to earn equality?
Many Indigenous issues derive from cultural systemic racism and white supremacist beliefs that Indigenous people are deserving of lesser respect. The removal of Indigenous mascots will disrupt the cycle of Indigenous racism. While limited to case settlements versus Dufferin Peel and the City of Mississauga, I hope these settlements make future fights to preserve Indigenous mascots seem pointless, even though I did not win a single case in the Canadian or Ontario human rights tribunals. I lost versus the CBSC and to George Brown College, a publicly funded community college that advertised with the Washington NFL team. The George Brown complaint was filed because the college blocked me from contacting the school's Indigenous community to raise the issue about the ad. It seems that I needed to be a direct member of the college community to be offended by the ad. Due to the ad and the fact that the college treated my complaint as a farce, likening the complaint to trying to kill a fly with an elephant, I would never affiliate with this organization, or the 5 Ontario colleges that have subsumed Indigenous names, whether the First Nations are associated with the province or not. Seneca, Algonquin, Conestoga, Sioux, and Mohawk colleges. To be clear, the elephant is Indigenous racism. A complaint to ban Indigenous mascots was unsuccessful versus the Ontario Ministry of Education in 2017. The ministry complaint was filed as a first application versus Dufferin Peel, resulted in problems at my wife's work. How? Boosted by support from Amnesty International and the Human Rights Commission, a Huffington Post op-ed I wrote on April 5, 2016, sought clarification of the board's policy on mascots. On Tuesday, April 26, 2016, Mrs. Gallant was called for a Friday interview for a job promised the previous September with the board. The job was 10 kilometers closer to our home. On April 27th, the board responded to a published request to discuss their policy by May 1st. The nature of the call made me feel the events were tied, and I felt bullied. I told Dufferin Peel that I would be filing a complaint on the use of mascot clothing in schools that day. On April 28th, Mrs. Gallant's interview was moved up, and by noon Thursday, she no longer had the job. When the HRTO sent back the complaint due to a technical issue, we pulled the complaint. We were afraid that my complaint could further affect Mrs. Gallant's employment. So with the help of the Human Rights Legal Support Center, I filed versus the Ministry of Education to get the change sought in schools. The ministry stated that it was not responsible for school board compliance to the code, which was odd. Odder still, a vice chair on the case, Douglas Sanderson, who describes himself as an Opaskwayak Cree, a First Nation, openly questioned my heritage and honesty in a case assessment direction without reason, prompting the submission of my certificate of Indigenous status to the HRTO. It seemed like he was attacking my Indian status to dismiss my claim. The ministry refuses to seize the opportunity to address Canada's flagrant Indigenous racism problem. Every time a student is asked to remove a discriminatory hat or t-shirt, you get to discuss racism. Instead, Canada puts its head in the sand about racism. If Indigenous racism were frequently addressed in schools, maybe Braden Bushby does not shout, "I fucking got one," when he hits pedestrian Barb Kentner with a trailer hitch in January 2017 that eventually kills Kentner. Maybe having his racist views challenged by an Ontario community committed to change makes Bushby not to view Kentner as target practice. Imagine if your life was taken from you because the authorities did not have the courage to address racism. How easy it could be for many of you to be imprisoned like Bushby. We only filed against Dufferin Peel a second time after the case versus Mississauga created problems for our daughters. They were getting yelled at for my positions in school. So a second Dufferin Peel filing was submitted to protect the girls, and we hoped that Mrs. Gallant would not be affected. Finally, I did not win versus the city of Mississauga. After hearings over 16 months, a ruling was denied as the tribunal vice chair was reassigned. The decision came on the same day I tweeted a complaint to the Ontario Human Rights Commission and Canada's Heritage Ministry for co-sponsoring RightsCon, a human rights conference in Toronto. RightsCon was held during the deliberation on the case versus Mississauga. A conference silver sponsor with the province of Ontario was the Ford Foundation. Ford was identified as the official truck on the Washington football team's website that day. The Human Rights Commission sponsoring a human rights conference with the official truck of the Washington Redskins seemed careless. The fact that the Mississauga case was scheduled to be reheard on the same day I negatively reacted to it disillusioned me, eliminating the last remnants of faith I had in the human rights process. But even if victory was muted by the justice system's faint heart, the settlement and the support from Amnesty International and later the Ontario Human Rights Commission will make two things clear about Indigenous mascots. First, Indigenous mascots are discriminatory. And second, Indigenous mascots are a human rights concern. Discrimination is determined by effect, not the intent. It does not matter what your intent is and whether you do other good works to help Indigenous people. When you marginalize people as mascots, you cause damage to their dignity and restrict their ability to participate as equals in society. You are not honoring us. Since mascots are a human rights concern, it is not something that can be voted on. Dignity is guaranteed to individuals. The Washington Post can no more hold a survey on a slur than Snoop Dogg can give you permission to call Oprah Winfrey the N-word. Please stop finding one Indigenous person or group who likes the mascot or is paid to like the mascot.
Just to make a note, Mr. Chairman, just because someone has a person of color, a black person working for them, does not mean they aren't racist. And it is insensitive that some would even say it's the fact that someone would actually use a prop, a black woman, in this chamber, in this committee, is alone racist in itself.
Just because a few Florida Seminole give support to Florida State, they cannot approve the hostile environment for Seminoles in Oklahoma. To illuminate the blind spot around North America's Indigenous issues, we must look at mascot events for what they are, keepers of mainstream white supremacy. When you see a person in redface at a Blackhawks game, does makeup color morally differentiate them from people who use blackface? Their intentions are the same, to mock and reinforce negative stereotypes. When fans wear headdresses, dance around, and whoop and wallop like they are playing Indian, they are perpetuating white supremacy. When they do the tomahawk chop, they are trivializing and mocking Indigenous culture. The tomahawk chop was used in May 2018 by players in a Quebec under-14 hockey game to taunt an Indigenous team. Like Freedom Riders, Indigenous hockey players in Canada must be trained to expect, to react, and to cope with racism before venturing into unwelcome territories of their reserves. They expect it will always be this way. So it was not surprising that Canada's shock over the incident was short-lived. The next month, 6 Toronto area school boards sent kids to a Jays Braves game. The Braves' name and logo are discriminatory. The team popularized the tomahawk chop.
I cannot give or sell you permission to deny the dignity of others.
It is common for many organizations to ignore Indigenous complaints until they cannot. Then they reach out to various Indigenous groups until they get the opinion that confirms colonialism. Mascot supporters do this to obscure a human rights issue, to make it seem that one key mascot supporter overrides the extension of dignity to all Indigenous. It is a tactic not tolerated by other racialized groups. It is a process being undertaken by the Atlanta Braves, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Kansas City Chiefs, and until recently, the Cleveland Indians. The Mississauga of the New Credit Chief, who with Peel Region are the major funders of Peel Aboriginal, were sought out to approve the chief name. Indigenous leaders must stop compromising the dignity of unrelated Indigenous people. Indigenous leaders want others to realize that their cultures are distinctive, different from the hundreds of distinct peoples on Turtle Island, but then assume the responsibility to speak for more than just their culture. No reasonable person asks a French leader for consent to use English slurs. Many Indigenous groups contribute to the same stereotyping as non-Indigenous. Six Nations citizens are steadfast opponents of misappropriation. They do not wish for others to use their culture in negative ways. Yet Six Nations uses Blackhawk on their minor hockey league jersey. The logo uses Neanderthal-like images that reinforces the stereotype of the savage Indian, a stereotype that pervades North American culture, contributing to a hostile environment for all Indigenous people. Six Nations' use of the Blackhawks logo is used to justify its mainstream use, undermining the credibility of other Indigenous objections. It is the golden rule that must apply. If you want others to treat your culture with dignity, you must extend dignity to others. When leaders who do not represent me try to decide what is appropriate for me, it feels as if I'm being told to mind my pretty little head and let the adults speak. My complaints, while supported by academic literature, U.S. civil rights opinions, and the Human Rights Commission of Ontario, are ignored. I am not Indigenous enough for them. In the Mississauga hearing, after producing my card versus the Ministry of Education, the Vice Chair went further. He questioned the validity of my status card. Like every other Canadian, he assumed his individual right to evaluate any Indigenous person's qualification before they are accepted as Indigenous by any individual of the dominant culture. I cannot remember if I swore directly at him or told him he did not have the effing right to decide anyone's indigeneity. But swearing out of anger on the stand, while demanded by my honor, was not useful in getting the deserved result. But that is what the dominant culture does. It ignores the rules, reminds you that they do not apply to you, you lesser being, until you explode. Then they use the age-old settler trick of playing Indigenous people off against one another. That way, the dominant culture can justify hushing any complaint and maintain its stance on Indigenous rights, as they have always done. They find an excuse to deny dignity and work with whomever will allow them to support the status quo. It was surprising to see the tactic used by an officer of the Human Rights Tribunal. Sure, I don't appear Indigenous. I have not faced issues common to other Indigenous groups. But I am part of the Halapu Band, and Indigenous mascots reinforce the negative status of Indigenous people that motivated my family to hide their heritage. Even as the case versus Mississauga was being slow-played to its conclusion, the Human Rights Commissioner Renu Mandane was still surveying reactions to Indigenous mascots. Mandane acknowledged that based on the Commission's research that mascots were harmful before the 2016 American League Championship Series. Yet in late 2017, Sylvia Miracle, Executive Director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Fellowship Centres, a Commission partner who does not represent me, asked why the Commission has the authority to decide the main priorities of Indigenous communities. Miracle assumed her right to tell the Commission that mascots were not important to the entire Indigenous community. That community includes me and my family. Miracle does not know us, nor did she aid our family. Yet, in late 2017, she was afforded the opportunity to speak for us. Once the harm of mascots was identified, why did the survey continue? Aware of the ongoing survey during the Mississauga hearings, the assessment on the eligibility for my legal protections increasingly frustrated me. When the case limped to its delayed conclusion in February 2018, it was obvious I was going to lose. It was just a matter of how. I wrote a paper on academia on the case in March 2018, but did not publicize it. Most of the observations in that paper are included here in this work. In May 2018, the non-decision was announced and a rehearing was issued. It confirmed my loss of faith in the tribunal process. Canada is a country defined by the laws we enforce, not the laws we write. Systemic racism thrives in the inconsistencies between the two.
The right to deny Indigenous human rights is imprinted on children through sports and tradition.
This double standard for Indigenous rights is not lost on the young. The tomahawk chop was used by the MAGA kids in the January 2019 Lincoln Monument confrontation with Nathan Phillips, and then on national TV to salute the Kansas City Chiefs game the following Sunday. The MAGA Kids incident highlighted the merger of culturally accepted racism. White nationalist sympathizers have embraced MAGA, just as they embrace Indigenous mascots, with their red-faced, scientifically racist mascots, and mocking tomahawk chop. It is easy to label MAGA supporters as MAGists, people who appear to want all the benefits of a racially segregated society without the shame or burden of calling themselves racist. But that is a simplification. Many MAGA concerns are correct. They have been left behind. Society has changed, but race is not the problem. MAGists are being misled by opportunists who misdirect their anger towards upheaval, away from those profiting of economic inequities. MAGists should be longing not for a whiter society, but for what was a fairer society that existed after World War II. A time when billionaires, sports owners or not, could not use and our institutions could resist the economic influence of the rich to suffocate economic stability, educational or economic opportunity, social justice, or human and civil rights. To begin to implement equality, we must no longer allow unfettered racism to exist in the mainstream. As reported by Professor Jesse Steinfeld, the expert in the human rights hearing versus Mississauga, studies on stereotype activation by Kim Prieto et al. Concluded that the use of American Indian images in sports serves to activate a stereotype generating process within people, creating a racially hostile environment for all parties who are exposed to Indigenous-themed sport mascot logos. Simply put, the science says Indigenous mascots perpetuate racism against other targeted groups as well. Was the black man in the middle of this tomahawk chop picture thinking of Atlanta's original AAA baseball team? They were the Crackers, a highly successful minor league team that changed their name when they moved to Virginia. This was a year or two after Malcolm X started calling white people crackers. Seems when faced with racism and the ability to make a change is obvious. Nice pick. Mascots are especially problematic as American cities with native mascotted teams all have significant black or non-white populations. Can you imagine black-faced residents of these cities dancing while chanting a black slur at their sporting events? Mississauga is 57% non-white too. Is the presence of the Indigenous mascots in culturally diverse cities a symptom of a longing for the time when Magists say, North America was great? And if Indigenous mascots weren't offensive, would teams need to construct naming fairy tales? The Braves were named due to the affiliation that 1910 owner James Gaffney had with Tammany Hall, who, in the 18th century, had members split up into tribes to prove their true American identity. However, Indian costumes were banned at Tammany during the War of 1812. The Cleveland Indians chose their name after their namesake Nap LaJoie left the team and copied the 1914 series winner Boston Braves. Their chief Wahoo-loving fans still cling to this practice, but the name is no more. The Chicago Blackhawks were formed in 1926. They were named for owner Frederick McLaughlin's 86th Infantry Division that is said to be named for the 19th century Illinois Sauk leader, but military records differ. The 86th Division was named for pioneers who defeated Black Hawk and their prowess in the battles with the Indians. The name is a celebration of colonialism, not of native heritage. The Washington football team's name was the Braves in 1932. When they switched stadiums to share facilities with the Red Sox, they changed their name to the R word to save money. Over time, the logo, like the Blackhawk mirror image, took on the appearance of the slope brow indigenous as Neanderthal. The name ended in 2020. These mascots reflect the dehumanization of Chief Irontail on the Buffalo nickel. Can you imagine the $10 Viola Desmond or the $20 Harriet Tubman bills featuring the same racist characterization? The Kansas City Chiefs were named in honor of Mayor Hatro Bartle, who received his nickname for his association with the Mikkosay Honor Society in the Boy Scouts of America. The Mikkosay tribe liberally appropriated Indigenous culture to celebrate their victory and dominance over Indigenous people. The Boy Scouts organization were recently bankrupted by sexual assault claims. Yay, Chiefs.
I'm sure you treat all peoples equally.
Except the Quebecois.
And the Newfies.
Stupid Newfies!
I'm a Newfie! Whee!
In Ontario, you sometimes feel like you are outed as a Newfoundlander. giving the smallest insight into what it might be like to be outed as a gay person. You brace yourself for stupidity, with the first comment by the person hearing the news revealing if the person values you and if you will ever be friends again. Except for one or two comments, Newfie jokes did not happen for the 8 years I lived outside Canada. My Canadian heritage had been discovered when we lived in Japan and the US. No other mention was ever made of my intelligence because of my origin. Generally, only mainland Canadians do this to Newfoundlanders. "Oh, you're a Newfie." A comment made with a shit-eating grin of ignorance. Newfie jokes are annoying, but reasonable people know they are offside. Nobody likes to be called stupid, savages, or drunks. Indigenous racism is different. It is unnoticed, accepted by people who profess to hate racism. Complaints about Indigenous racism are greeted with the annoyance of a parent enduring a petulant child. Can you imagine slurs being used for sporting events with black or Jewish mascots? Replace "the Indians went on the warpath and scalped the Braves" with terms that apply to another racialized or sexual minority. Mainstream culture excludes the Indigenous experience and is accepting of Indigenous racism. When slurs are used at sporting events, reporting is oblivious to the elephant in the room. In 2016, Andrew Shaw was suspended for using a homophobic slur towards an NHL referee. No mention was made of the Indigenous slur on the team jersey, even as the APA report on homophobic slurs mirrors the report on the harm of Indigenous mascots. The sad thing is that this situation was not an exception. Kevin Pillar was suspended for a slur at a Braves game. A Chicago fan was suspended for taunting Devontae Pelly-Smith with black slurs at a Blackhawks game.
Definitely something like the Charlottesville rally.
Yo! Obviously, we don't support that kind of behavior, and I think in this day and age, I think it's time to start moving past that and realize that we don't want to stoop to those levels.
You want racial progression, and he's like, listen, let's focus on our racist logo first. He's like, there's no place for that kind of discrimination in this house. And by the way,
In March 2019, the Maple Leafs' Morgan Riley was falsely accused of using a homophobic slur. The team stated that it would be inappropriate as the Leafs are committed to the environment they are creating for everybody. The next night, they played the Blackhawks, a team name and logo identified as discriminatory by provincial leaders in Saskatchewan and Quebec. In November 2019, Bill Peters, coach of the Calgary Flames, was correctly fired for slurring Akim Aliu, a professional athlete in the Chicago Blackhawks organization, in 2009. The organization name was ignored. The hockey world focused on issues of inclusion, from the NHL to Rogers' hometown hockey in Canada. Then Rogers ended their hometown hockey broadcasts with white kids in Indigenous mascot uniforms. Mark Crawford, the current Blackhawks assistant coach, was suspended for harassing several players, including Newfoundland's Harold Druken. Druken describes Crawford as the worst person ever. The nature of the harassment equaled Bill Peters' conduct. Crawford made offensive ethnic slurs, but he was reinstated in January 2020. I am a lucky member of two cultural groups, Indigenous and Newfoundlanders, whose harassment is thought insignificant by the NHL and the Chicago Blackhawks. As a Newfoundlander, however, unlike Francis Verow-Paul, I never had to play for the McGill Redmen or against the Sorel Tracy Hawks and compromise my dignity to play hockey. In 2005, an incident at a Quebec Major Junior Hockey League game ended tolerance for abusive language in most minor sports. Former NHL player and coach Ted Nolan, an Ojibwe, was abused so forcefully it left him trembling after the game. In response, anti-discrimination policies were enacted in most of Hockey Canada and other minor sports that reacts to discriminatory language with significant player and coach suspensions. Yet during the Mississauga process, and after consultation with Hockey Canada, the Greater Toronto Hockey League decided to continue to use the Blackhawks logo based on the consent of a single group. In 2018, the last winner of the Royal Bank Cup for Canada's National Junior A Championship was the Chilliwack Chiefs. In Canada, calling an Indigenous person chief is akin to calling a Black or African American person boy. Our institutions, like the Ontario Human Rights Commission, talk about the sins of systemic discrimination. They identify themselves as champions of equality as they partner with Bell, owners of TSN and CTV, on the mental illness initiative Let's Talk, even as Bell continues to profit from racism through its discriminatory NFL broadcasts. Social justice champions do not knowingly affiliate with or profit from hate. During the hearing versus the City of Mississauga, it was uncomfortable. It is an unpopular cause, but the ubiquity of racism against Indigenous is mind-numbing at times. Almost without exception, people defend mascots and their supporters like Donald Trump supporting fine people on both sides. Teachers, professionals, university administrators, lawyers, all grasping to deny dignity to Indigenous people. Many people stopped talking to me, with one hockey administrator's last venomous words to me stating that I did not even have the right to complain. A month before the second set of hearings on March 27, 2017, Don Cherry, hockey commentator, and Rachel Goder appeared on his national CBC feature Coach's Corner in a Chiefs jersey from the Slapshot movie. His hands were in tinfoil, ready to fight. It was irresponsible timing for his first appearance in a Chiefs jersey. Cherry had a national platform, is a longtime Mississauga resident, and active in the local hockey community. He was on Hockey Night promoting the tradition of Indigenous mascots during a human rights hearing on the topic. I was worried he would incite someone to attack my kids. Sounds silly, right? But consider this. Rogers Hometown Hockey was in Mississauga on December 22, 2018, after the settlement with the city. My kids said their friends were asked not to wear native mascot jerseys to the event. Instead, Hometown Hockey, Cherry et al., featured a Chiefs head jersey when talking about beloved former mayor Hazel McCallion in their interview. Preserving mascots is about power and keeping people in their place. And this was a Christmas reminder of my place. At least Canada's clown prince of racism was not Prime Minister. Sponsors line up to affiliate with Indigenous mascots. Without guidance from human rights institutions that sponsoring Indigenous mascots perpetuates racism, over 240 corporations stood back and stood by ads placed with Indigenous mascotted broadcasts in 2018. In one TSN Monday Night Football broadcast in September 2019, over 90 corporations affiliated with the Washington football team. There were even Canadian election ads from the Liberal Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, and to encourage voting while slurring 4% of the population, Elections Canada. The night before the 2021 election, even the NDP joined in. Bill Maher, on his HBO show Real Time with Bill Maher, lambasted former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer for disrespecting Barack Obama. Yet he called Senator Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas.
Hold on.
Come on.
When we
They don't like you, Pocahontas.
Considering struggles like murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, an Indigenous woman would have been outraged to be associated with the over-sexualization of a younger than Lolita, prepubescent Indigenous girl. Most disappointing, even human rights champions are in on Indigenous discrimination. Ruth Bader Ginsburg referenced the Discovery Doctrine in a land claim decision versus the Oneidas in 2005. Even RFK Human Rights Award winner Barack Obama is a Blackhawks fan who turns a blind eye to discrimination. It is appalling when leaders normalize racist sentiments, accept or refer to other people as subhuman, or discount struggles of North America's Indigenous. Lost in the noise, psychological researchers at the University of Michigan and UC Berkeley studied Native American views on mascots. Roughly 2/3 opposed the Redskins' name, the tomahawk chop, headdresses, or imitation Native American dances. Their poll differs from non-academic opinion polls of the Washington Post, which co-lead author, psychological professor, and Tulalip tribe member Stephanie Freiberg says were often used to silence Native people and to deny Indigenous human rights. For the uninitiated, non-academic polls are what academics call horseshit. In 2020, when Indigenous mascotted teams posted their support for Black Lives Matter, their virtue signaling was unwelcome. Sponsor pressure for change was successful in Washington and Edmonton. Cleveland changed his name in 2021. The Edmonton team originally decided to keep their name in February 2020, as their survey did not find a consensus of Inuit offended by the slur. CBC, all too willing to play the complicit lapdog of systemic Indigenous racism, showed that Nunavut Minister for Community Services Lauren Kusagak supported the name. He told those offended to take a Valium. CBC never does stories getting the perspective of those defending other forms of racism. Teams in Atlanta, Kansas City, and Chicago are trying to stall to keep their names, with Kansas City and Chicago banning Native chants, headdresses, and dances at their games. Like Dan Snyder, each team is reaching out to local Indigenous groups to seek permission for generic Indigenous slurs. The Kansas City Chiefs tomahawk chopped their way to victory at Super Bowl 54, with fans and owners toying with Indigenous imagery, giving the foam finger to all who disapproved. The same fans booed a Black Lives Matter moment of silence when they started the 2020 season. Only then did many see racism at a Chiefs game. The NHL created a diversity alliance of primarily black hockey players. The Diversity Alliance excludes Indigenous players like Carey Price or Ted Nolan and avoids discussion of the Chicago name. They diminish Ted Nolan, who, after winning the Coach of the Year in 1997, was frozen out from coaching hockey for 8 years.
Well, if I was white, I'd be coaching for sure.
On August 1st, 2020, when the NHL resumed play, it featured the Blackhawks in support of BLM. 3 NHL players converged on center ice in an anti-racism stance. 4 players right of center, Cree citizen Ethan Bear stood. Sometimes he wears a jersey with his name in Cree on the back, a tribute to the resiliency of his people. Bear is from Saskatchewan, where the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations is supportive of the work to end mascots as they contribute to Indigenous racism. To ask Bear to stand by and watch as his peers take a stand against racism, using a logo that mocks his culture, is a bullying, disgraceful display, the epitome of workplace harassment. The NHL, Sportsnet, and the CBC even pointed to this moment as when the league came together against racism. It happened in Canada. If you are Canadian, you should be ashamed. Within 11 months of the BLM moment, Matt Dumba won the King Clancy Award. Subban and Nurse got new contracts. Beer was harassed and traded. This is every bit as callous as Quebec nurses taunting Joyce Echaquan as she listened on her deathbed, but with a public platform that encourages others to do the same. While the NHL joined BLM, it ignored the same violence against Indigenous people in Canada. From April 8th to June 18th, 2020, 6 Indigenous people were killed by police in Canada. Aisha Hudson, 16, robbery suspect killed seated in a disabled stolen car. April 8th, 2020 in Winnipeg.
In this video, you hear police shooting.
You don't shoot when you have a vehicle already stopped.
Jason Collins, 38, at a domestic incident on April 8th, 2020 in Winnipeg. Stuart Kevin Andrews, 22, a robbery and vandalism suspect on April 18th, 2020 in Winnipeg. Patrick Everett, 42, died on April 20th, 2020, fatally injured in police custody on April 12th in Prince George, BC. Chantel Moore, 26, a single mother during a wellness check on June 4th, 2020 in New Brunswick. Rodney Levi, a 48-year-old man found trespassing with knives on June 18th, 2020 in New Brunswick. When describing the experience of Indigenous since colonization, genocide is a word that is reluctantly used. The presence of Indigenous mascots trivializes any discussion of Indigenous genocide. Until 2019, even the Canadian Museum for Human Rights refused to acknowledge the genocide of Indigenous people. When the museum did, the recognition was important. It began the process of dousing the gaslight of North America's Indigenous experience. To illustrate the nature of the genocide, if you compare the long-term effects of the accepted genocides of the 20th century, in the Belgian Congo, the Armenian genocide, the Holodomor, or the Holocaust, all have had an effect on the long-term annual average population increase of the targeted populations. The worst is the Holocaust, which has slowed the growth rate of the world Jewish population to less than 1/3 of world population growth rates. By comparison, since contact with Europeans, Indigenous populations have experienced a negative constant annual growth rate. The population is down by half to 6 million from Dobbin's estimates of 12 million in pre-contact North America. 12 million translates into a pre-contact population density like modern-day Alaska. There was a human influence on the decline of Indigenous populations. North America's dominant cultures, Britain, Canada, and the US, refused to recognize their influence or the criminal aspects of their past. Worse, North America denies and mocks the cultural experience of North America's Indigenous, further excluding them from the societies eager to deny their very existence at all. Saying there was an Indigenous genocide does not lessen the effects of the Holocaust or the Holodomor. All genocides have been calamitous for the affected populations and leave long-term scars. Each genocide was different. Some, like the Holocaust, were carried out in a systematic process over a relatively short period. Others, like the Indigenous genocide, were persistent and gradual over 5 centuries to consolidate British, American, and Canadian control over conquered land. Scalping bounties were replaced by Indian reserves, which were replaced by residential schools, which have been replaced by forced foster care of Canada's Indigenous children. Some examples of the persistence of Indigenous genocide. Slavery began at contact in the merged world by Columbus. By 1503, African slaves were imported to Hispaniola to replace Taino, and by 1513, in the U.S. territory, Puerto Rico. The Taino, 1 million strong at contact, reduced to fewer than 30,000 under slavery by 1518, were decimated further by a smallpox epidemic brought by African slaves, well after the genocide began. By 1506, English and Portuguese took brute beasts, as the Beothuk were taken as slaves. The Dutch began scalp bounties in 1641, the French in 1688, the English in 1694. Heads, arms, and other proof of Indian death were rewarded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s. The Scalping Proclamation of 1756 in Nova Scotia is still officially active. Private citizens killing Indigenous people to protect property is still justifiable, with unpunished 2016 murders of Colton Bushy in Bigger, Saskatchewan, and John Stiers in Hamilton, Ontario. Jeff Amherst gave smallpox blankets to extirpate this execrable race. They are too far away to hunt down like dogs. 11 states and 5 provinces celebrate Amherst with place names, and there is an Amherst College in Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830 that sought to remove Indigenous tribes from America's southeastern states, as they had already been removed in northeastern states. History acknowledges the death of over 4,000 Native Americans along the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. Egerton Ryerson, architect of Canada's residential school system and namesake for Ryerson University, began his first residential school in modern-day Mississauga in the 1820s. By the late 1840s,
the Wigwam village disappeared at the Credit Mouth, as did the stench of the fish offals and refuse which littered the land they used. The land has been the site of the Mississauga Golf and Country Club since 1906.
The club used this logo until 2018, when, out of respect, I shared the logo and old Mississauga news clippings with the chief of the Mississauga of the New Credit. He worked with the club to change the logo. The Mississauga are not as stated in the first issue of the Mississauga News under the headline of What's in a Name.
The Mississauga have been described as lazy, shiftless good-for-nothings.
Ryerson is slow to change its name. To put it in perspective, Senator Murray Sinclair estimates that the residential school started by Ryerson killed 15,000 to 30,000 Indigenous children.
Final TRC report documents 3,200 deaths, mainly due to disease and malnutrition. But that doesn't reflect the actual number. Today, the commissioner says he believes it's much higher.
Perhaps as much as 5 to 10 times as high as that. It's because the records are so poor.
The NAACP has calculated from 1882 to 1968, 3,446 black people were lynched by white supremacist hate groups like the KKK. There is no university in the U.S. named for Nathan Bedford Forrest. Abraham Lincoln is known for his emancipation of slaves in the U.S. He is not remembered for signing the order for a mass execution of 38 Dakota on December 26, 1862. John A. Macdonald advocated residential schools in 1879 and was known for starving Indian peoples on reserves. He thought removing Indians from parental influence was necessary to teach them the habits and modes of thought of white men. Many monuments to John A. Macdonald are being questioned. It's not cancel culture to reassess a person's cumulative achievements. Cancel culture celebrates a person's contributions to the dominant culture while canceling out the pain of others. Starved on Canada's reserves, Sitting Bull's people were killed when they returned to the U.S. at Wounded Knee by American forces. 20 medals were awarded for the gunning down of Native people. 7th Cavalry Commander James Forsyth has a town named after him in Montana. Canadian Samuel Whitside was the major of the 1st Squadron. Residential schools were seen as a final solution to Canada's Indian problem, despite the loss of Indigenous children's natural resistance to illness at the schools. Hitler copied Bosque Redondo concentration camps and praised the efficiency of America's Indian extermination, as he copied the concept of the final solution from Canada. South Africa sent bureaucrats to Canada to study the reserve system to set up apartheid. In January 2017, Quebec's coroner's office challenged Canada's Aboriginal reserve system as an apartheid regime that treats Aboriginal people as wards of the state who are considered incapable and unfit. Henry Louis Gates noted that on pre-Civil War censuses, black people were typically listed without their names, as property. In June 2021, Indigenous people could finally get government documents with their chosen name. In 2021, most provinces in Canada announced social services policy changes. Automatic birth alerts will not continue whenever Indigenous mothers are expected. They operated on the general assumption that Indigenous mothers cannot care for their child, and to teach them the habits and modes of thought of white men. Like Germany, with institutions that inspired Hitler's and South Africa's cruelties, why don't Canadians reconcile their susceptibility to inflict cruelty? Residential schools are considered cultural genocide in Canada, where children were removed from their parents to force them to learn the habits and modes of thought of white men. Canada issued a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on residential schools in 2015. Despite the recent papal apology, the Catholic Church still runs U.S. Indian mission schools. Notre Dame, host to the St. Joseph High School Indians, deniers of their host Potawatomi's request to change the Indians' name, frequent home to Chicago Blackhawks training camps, ran 5 genocidal Indian mission schools in 2017, including the Pine Ridge School. It is unlikely the purposes differ for running these schools from the Conference on Residential Education for Cultural Acculturation put forward by Canada's Oblate Fathers in 1958. The Catholic Church has not paid $38 of the $54 million it was required to pay in settlement for abuse at residential schools. Religious teachers at St. Anne's Residential School tortured Indigenous children who spoke their own language with electric chair shocks. Understand why Ethan Bear's Cree nameplate is important. The Catholic Church is a morals organization that chooses organization over morals. The Pope can keep his apology on residential schools. The Church gave the moral justification for slavery, colonization, and genocide. The Church profited from it. Dealing in death and stealing in the name of the Lord.
The path forward starts with simple changes.
What can you do? Acknowledge the mistreatment of Indigenous in Canada. Stop turning a blind eye to what you ought to realize is unwelcome. Stop sponsoring discriminatory events. Stop broadcasting them. Stop wearing their gear. The power of sport is to lift people up, not to keep people down. People affected by racism need to recognize that racism against Indigenous people increases the tolerance of racism against other targeted groups. Indigenous mascots do more than perpetuate racism against Indigenous people. They breed racial intolerance and keep North American society susceptible to exploitation by white supremacist agitators. If you are to change the culture of Indigenous racism, you can no longer allow racism to fester in society. More work must be done to ferret out remnants of white supremacist theory from mainstream ideas. Academics could take my observations on scientific racism and the extermination factor and put them into the context of sociocultural research. I need help because human rights are only loosely guaranteed. They are promised to all, but unfortunately, they are, at best, aspirational, acquired fully by only those with wealth and power. In Canada, pronouns were corrected in the national anthem for prominent white feminist activists. In North America, Indigenous kids cannot go to school, a mall, an arena, watch TV, or browse the internet without persistent corporate-sponsored or institutionally sanctioned racism. Canada and the U.S. must become more than countries founded on colonization and immigration. This exclusionary lie is still repeated in the policies and guidelines of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. As an Indigenous person, it is far from a subtle reminder of the order of things in this colonial country. We need to reform Canada's human rights institutions. 6 times, I failed to get equal status for the discrimination of Indigenous mascots from human rights tribunals, even though Indigenous mascots meet every standard for what ought to be reasonably known as unwelcome. In retrospect, my attempts to remove mascots through the tribunals will age better than their inaction to protect them. My experience reveals human rights tribunals that are underfunded, designed to draw out proceedings to coerce settlements. The extended process puts a target on the backs of complainants, a target significant enough to discourage others from complaining. The system lacks a prescriptive process for solutions to address common complaints, where itemized procedures could remedy common situations, reduce costs for the respondent, minimize isolation for the complainant, and create an opportunity for standardized human rights education. The system lacks an avenue to jointly ask questions to the tribunal like, are Indigenous mascots discriminatory? Or, does subsidizing discriminatory organizations create a hostile environment? A procedure for faster resolutions that seeks guidance without blame. The process is disdained by all levels. After the settlement with Dufferin Peel, the settlement was not enforced. Kate stayed off the school hockey team until mid-December 2018, and she began playing only when I announced the settlement publicly. In the 2019-2020 season, Dufferin Peel schools still did not comply. Rather than returning to the tribunal, I filed a complaint against the offending school principal for not providing a safe and accepting environment with the Ontario College of Teachers. But the complaint with the College of Teachers was denied. Dufferin Peel was found to be providing a safe and accepting environment where Indigenous racism is taken seriously. The College of Teachers adjudicator implied that a private side deal was struck for players to continue using their mascot bags that superseded the tribunal settlement. The bags are an expense that applied only to players who paid up to $5,000 per year to play on a competitive Chiefs team. The adjudicator valued Kate's dignity at less than a $50 hockey bag. This is the same government that has Lynn Bayek's barbecue buddy, Greg Rickford, as Minister of Energy, Mines, Northern Development, and Indigenous Affairs, and dismissed all plans to add Indigenous content to school curriculum. This Ford government have given signals as being closed for reconciliation. Bayakers are gonna bayak. The biased result in Dufferin Peel's disregard for the settlement was not unexpected. I had experience with the HRTO before working against mascots, and I tried to use my knowledge of the process to create change. In 2012, I signed a HRTO settlement with Horizon Utilities over a Newfie drink. This was after I resigned in September 2010 due to the hostile environment intensified by the HRTO complaint. But I always sensed something was wrong after the settlement. After years of looking, in late 2017, I found that prior to the hearing, Horizon Utilities filed an Ontario Energy Board report in October 2011. The report cited financial reporting problems for the Energy Retrofit Incentive Program I ran for precisely my employment period. While not mentioned by name, the only program evaluated was my program. Horizon did not disclose the report to the HRTO in 2012. If the report had been disclosed, considering I resigned over a note to my personnel file I disagreed with, a defamation of character suit would have followed. Upon finding the OEB filing, I worked with the Human Rights Legal Support Center to file a breach of settlement claim. I had also worked with the Legal Support Center versus Dufferin Peel and the Ministry of Education. HRTO settlements typically prevent signatories from discussing the agreement, the complaint, or disparaging the counterparty, effectively sweeping away the issue. Based on my Horizon experience, I did not want to sign another NDA, even with Dufferin Peel. I felt the previous NDA enhanced Horizon's ability to carry out retribution, since I could not speak to people about my departure from Horizon. During the Dufferin Peel settlement negotiations, the Legal Support Center refused to recognize my fear of NDAs, instead believing I was only seeking attention. Without the partial NDA versus Dufferin Peel, I could not have pressured Dufferin Peel in 2018 to momentarily honor the settlement, and Kate would not have played that year. The cost of the partial NDA, the Legal Support Center reneged on representing me in my breach hearing versus Horizon. In January 2019, at the breach of settlement hearing, I was without counsel. The witness claimed it was normal course of business for utilities to do individual audits. Yet examples provided only showed province-wide audits. The breach case was dismissed. It left me feeling gaslighted by the HRTO. Without counsel, I filed a reprisal claim in November 2019. A former Ontario Energy Board employee stated conservation audits were led by the province. Though originally accepted, the reprisal claim was not forwarded to the respondent and rejected in late 2020 in a manipulated process where laws and procedures are subject to change without notice. My jaded perspective on human rights is warranted. The HRTO settlement with Mississauga listed 3 groups to advise on mascots that the Human Rights Commission knew to be accepting of mascots. The Commission signed a deal, not only assigning individual rights to third parties, but with the expectation that some mascots would persist. When Kate played against the GTHL's Willowdale Blackhawks in 2019, she dressed in the girls' dressing room, as always. Another girl played on the Willowdale boys' midget team and dressed with her. The Willowdale player apologized for the logo. The kid knows better than the Human Rights Commission. It was not a surprise to me that the HRTO, when presented proof of non-disclosed reports that I consider retaliation, treated me as the offender. When I told the Legal Support Center about the complications and punitive nature of the NDA, they thought I was seeking publicity. Clearly, the HRTO will not protect its house and misleads applicants on the protections from retribution, and in bad faith will not protect those abused in the process. My contempt with the human rights processes is shared by the Canadian government. In January 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the federal government's long-standing underfunding of child and family services discriminates against 163,000 First Nations children on the grounds of race and national and ethnic origin. The Canadian government ignored multiple non-compliance motions to pay a settlement to Indigenous children. With each appeal, Sidney Blackstock had to return to the court, like Charlie Brown trying to kick Justin Trudeau's football, hoping that Canada would pay. Only when not paying became politically unmanageable did the federal government agree to pay a settlement. And only then did they drop their right to appeal. In August 2020, The Pointer, a Brampton-based online local news site, did an article on Indigenous mascots and systemic racism framed by ads for a Mississauga Blackhawks tournament. The story stated the city of Mississauga's Sherry Lichterman wrote in an email after the settlement with me that it was business as usual as it relates to the teams playing and practicing in our buildings and wearing their jerseys. A Mississauga employee, speaking to The Pointer anonymously at a fair of retribution, stated Mississauga had not introduced an Indigenous element to its diversity and inclusion training. In late 2021, after the virtue signaling of Truth and Reconciliation Day and the Braves World Series victory, the Blackhawk organization's abuse of Kyle Beach dominated the news. Once again, the hockey world stood against abuse in hockey and ignored the Blackhawks logo. Like Mississauga, the teachers, the sponsors, and adjudicators, each enabler understands how mascots are wrong. They just don't care. They know whose rights are protected and whose they can ignore. People know that complaining in Canada, even on issues that may have been decided, puts a target on complainants' backs. By design, the HRTO magnifies the target, discouraging complaints, and is a barrier to social justice. For instance, the Ontario Tribunal is proud of its work to release Adam Capet from 1,657 days of solitary confinement, rather than seeing its inability to prevent race-based torture as a systemic failure. Neglecting to stand up against mascots is only corroborating evidence of Canada's Human Rights Tribunal's fundamental design to protect the government, not the citizens whom they serve. I wrote an op-ed in the Huffington Post in April 2016 on my mascot activism. It read, "If my efforts fail, it will reinforce my cynical views that these institutions are toothless kangaroo courts of consensus, guided by barometric pressure, not magnetic force, representing Canada's cross-fingered commitment to human rights. But if I win, then it will underline my belief in Canada and how we define ourselves as Canadians. I bet on the decency of Canadians. Decency is yet to win. Human rights institutions are the false front of the Canadian justice system, a facade added to give the appearance of stature. They expose a misunderstanding in Canada. Toughness is confused with stifling opposition, or is sold as withstanding abuse. It is weakness to stand up to abusers. Keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and you can belong. Or one day, get your opportunity to stand on others. For me, the easy path for re-entry into the economy and society is to accept my lesser place, to overlook the Indigenous racism that diminishes Canada. It is the just us system. I am not amongst the us. In the end, I would rather be a targeted dissenter than choose to be shouted down by a craven society where people are scared to make a stand against injustice, because they know the powerful can effortlessly silence and exclude dissenters without penalty.
The culture of Indigenous racism permeates all in Canadian society, including its institutions.
It is because of my experience with the HRTO that I have featured judicial nonfeasance, the failure of the justice system to perform an act that is required by law, the equal protection of all its citizens, as a central feature of the culture of Indigenous racism. Built upon white supremacy and the doctrine of discovery, Canada's system of justice is influenced by a culture of Indigenous racism that permeates the justice system and the justices who do its work. The justice system wraps itself in the cowardly protection of precedent, as if past rulings, influenced by centuries of white supremacy, protects them from the responsibility of doing what is right, what is difficult. Rather than being blind, the justice system looks back, holding firm on the rudder that steers Canadian justice on a course set by less tolerant forefathers, muting the will of the people to preserve Anglo-centric ideals of a colonial past. In doing so, justices vacate their responsibility and commit treason to Canada's very ideals. We must amend the concepts of our judicial process to ensure that justices evaluate the conformity of past rulings with current concepts of justice and fairness. We must no longer accept the purity of past rulings, the glorification of colonialism, and come to consider the criminal aspects of Canada's past. We must examine our traditions against our current legal standards for racism. Even the Human Rights Commission of Ontario did a survey on people's experiences and perceptions about Indigenous mascots, but they did not offer a legal evaluation on the environment produced by Indigenous mascots against what ought to be reasonably known as unwelcome. Worse, the notion that Indigenous people must be asked if they desire respect is built upon the notion that as lesser beings, we are not aware of the importance of our dignity. In Brown versus the Board of Education, no black or colored organization were ever asked if they were offended by the N-word. Human rights should never be subject to group opinion. I settled not because I doubted the accuracy of my opinions on Indigenous mascots, but because the justice system's inability to rule against or offend the dominant culture was made clear. I settled even though the funding of Indigenous mascot teams was not addressed, because this was the best possible compromise of my rights. A ruling that lays blame at corporate mascot sponsors was politically unattainable, and I settled with the hope that, free from the human rights process, I might be able to resume my career. I settled, quite frankly, because I could not afford to continue. The Human Rights Commission of Ontario's settlement with Mississauga, which appoints third-party groups to define the limits of my guaranteed rights as they see fit, does not define my dignity, but my exclusion from the benefits of citizenship. It is not a victory, but a reminder of place. I stopped calling myself Canadian the day a human rights court let others decide the limits of my rights. Because experience has taught me that precedent is the secret rule book that the rich use to gain access to rights unavailable to those unable to source the restricted passwords of past rulings. Precedent is the legal construct, for we have always done it that way. True justice is not available to all in Canada. It is only available to those with power and influence to tilt justice's scales, and unavailable to those whose rights can be acquired through power and influence. To end Indigenous racism, you must start with mascots. You must deny permission for people to treat Indigenous people as inferior. Cultural Indigenous racism in Canada is reflected in Indigenous dropout, incarceration, foster care, and sexual harassment rates that are higher than targeted populations in the U.S. Even after the closure of residential schools, it is still common for Indigenous youth to leave their reserve to finish high school in unwelcoming white communities. The strain of exclusion and the cultural disdain imprinted by mascots is a contributing factor to Indigenous youth suicide. Indigenous youth suicide is an urgent issue in Canada, and while there is much variation among communities, overall rates are high. Action is needed. Canada's neglected flowers in the attic will no longer be silent. With the focus on racism since 2020, many national figures in Canada are debating the genocide description of MMIW and the existence of systemic racism. They are having trouble reconciling their concept of Canada with the results of systemic Indigenous racism. I think missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a symptom of persistent systemic racism, and just one of the many forms Indigenous genocide has taken. Reconciliation is more about Canadians coming to terms with the criminal aspects of Canada's past. It is now that you must challenge what has been the fragile Canadian self-identity that prevents you from examining the mistakes, the crimes that were committed in the formation of Canada. You must overcome your shame. You must confront the sins of your past and move forward towards a more caring society. You must stop doing public votes and surveys on human rights and defending mainstream discrimination of Indigenous people. You must work to eliminate systemic bias that permeates your cultural institutions. Your founders created avenues for your societies to change and improve. Use them. While it is great that corporations exerted market pressure to force mascot name changes, it is a failure of the justice system for private interests to have to enforce the laws the courts do not have the temerity to uphold. Because the tenuous nature of human rights is a threat to democracy. We are not victims and allies. We are all participants in and defenders of equality. The denial of one person's dignity threatens everyone's. You must become a society that when they see a child in distress, that they find solutions that preserve the culture and the dignity of the child and family involved. When a child fears to leave his home to attend school, that you find solutions for the child to participate in education and become valued members capable of contributing to a better life in their home community and in their way, Canada. You must make sure that when a police officer hears about a missing Indigenous woman, they do not dismiss it as a squaw on a bender, but as a person equal to others and deserving of equal protection from violence and discrimination. You must invest in all your citizens, whether the investor is the Indigenous nation or the countries of Canada or the U.S., to ensure your societies become the societies you want them to be. You must come to terms with the sins of your country's founding and stop punishing Indigenous for reminding you of Canada's wrongdoings. Canada is imperfect and flawed, like anywhere else. You can decide to do better. In 2019, I asked the Humber Valley Sharks and City of Toronto to remove old Humber Valley Braves banners from Central Arena. It was done within a week. Seeing the change felt amazing. I want this pattern of respect for Indigenous dignity to be standard. Racism should never be tolerated or expected, because what you want is to live in a country where you can believe all things are possible. You want to live in a society without hate and cultural injustice. You want to believe with hard work people can achieve. That you belong to a country where our leaders realize that our country thrives when people believe and are given evidence of justice and fairness. A society where all are included and have equal opportunity to be a hero, a leader, a valued member with equal rights, or a hockey star.